On the west coast of Ireland, in the county of Galway, lies the peaceful and picturesque village of Leenane. Nestled at the crossroads of Westport, Clifton and Mam, at a place where the mountains of Mayo and Galway roll down to the harbour at Killary, Leenane is a village not unlike many others in Ireland, where traditions, faith and characters, once centrepieces of Celtic Ireland, are giving way to a melting pot of cultures, technology and commercial opportunities. One such character steeped in such tradition and faith was Bina McLoughlin. Ireland in the early 20th century was a poor country. The levels of poverty in many remote rural areas was remarkable by Western standards.
My name is Micheál McGrail. My mother was Molly White-Kine, and I was born in 1931. You know, we sold rabbits. That's all we had for money were rabbits. There was no immigration, but we had literally nothing. We had rationing, we had no money, and we had a great time.
In 1930, the total population was just under 3 million. The great majority of the people were living in the countryside, or in country towns and villages. In the early 1930s, the people of Ireland entertained themselves in a variety of ways. Crossroads dancing was a popular pastime, and often a stage or platform was built in the centre of the village. Crowds gathered from far and wide for nights of joviality, song and dance.
I live over near Balmain, and she always went to Balmain every Balmain Sunday, and we used to come back here to Leenane to the dances. And the first time I remember Bina, she was the most beautiful girl, lovely long black hair, and she was a good dancer, and she was very articulate.
A first encounter with Bina left a lasting booming voice. Bina seemed like a character from a different era, or maybe even straight out of a fairy tale.
I first met Bina when I was about 8 years old, and at that time I just thought she was a very beautiful woman. She always smiled. She wore very interesting clothing. It was colourful. Everyone else seemed to be in miniskirts, and Bina was in longer dresses, looking very traditionally Irish.
Bina was a fine, strong country woman. She had long black hair and layers and layers of dresses and skirts and chains and beads and that lovely woman.
She was a very traditional, rural Irish woman who didn't let fashion or trends or, the expectations of others influence her.
Well, basically, I'm a Dublin person and I grew up in Dublin. I went to university in Dublin. And when I was 23 years of age, there was a job advertised in a local cooperative that they were setting up in the area. And basically I came down to this area on the 31st of December 1973. Now, at the time, the main focus of the co-op was on farming and on sheep farming, because this is a big sheep farming area. And one of the tasks I was given by Michael O'Toole, who lived in Leenane at the time, was to organise the annual sheep show here in Leenane. And at the sheep show, I was taking all the entries in the car, out of the window of the car. And this lady came and she gave me £5, which was quite a bit of money back in 1974. She gave me £5 for the show in memory of her father. And I mentioned this to Michael O'Toole and he said, that's Bina McLoughlin. And that was the first time I met Bina.
But I remember one particular time, and it's a long time ago, I was expecting one of my children, and I had quite a nice black dress with pink flowers on the bottom of it. And it was quite an attractive dress. And she came to me one day and she said, Martina, she said, when you're finished with that, will you please give it to me? So I did. I remembered and I gave her the dress when I was finished with it. And it's quite a long time ago, and it was Easter time, and we were going for confessions in the church. We were all queuing up for confessions, and the next thing, Bina walks in with my black dress on her, with the pink flowers on the bottom. She had a pair of black runners with pink on them as well, and she also had a hat with a pink ribbon around it. And we were all standing in the queue, and Bina stood right in front of me, and she done a big twirl, and she said, you know something? She said, this is a very lucky dress. She said, you know, a man pulled up there, and she said, and he took my photograph, and he reckoned I was the finest woman he ever seen. So the dress was lucky for Bina.
The Ireland that Bina was born into was rooted in deep religious beliefs and practices. The Catholic Church had formidable influence and power on the lives of the people of Ireland, most especially on those living in the western rural countryside. Bina McLoughlin was a religious woman, a practicing and fully participating Catholic.
When Bina was hale and hearty, Mass was always of an evening time here in the village, and Bina would make an effort to come to Mass, and regardless of what the evening was like, hail, rain or shine, Bina would make it to Mass. She was extremely religious.
Bina had a real friend in a person that she grew up with in the locality, Father Micheál McGrail.
She always read in the church. She read the epistles. So when I was in charge here, I used to give her the epistles in advance. She learned off by heart, nearly. And then she'd come in on a Sunday morning and put on all her beautiful, she had all this beautiful ornamentation. She dressed up like that, you know, and she'd go up there and she'd read it out. And I can often look down in the church and see American tourists there. Say, who is this? Is this the prophet herself? She read it as if she wrote it. And of course, that's the way to read. The full meaning of her reading got across to the people.
She had another habit of, at communion time, she would race up the church. She would race up the church to be up there first. She always wanted to get up first. It didn't matter who was ahead of her. She'd tear up the church on a Sunday morning to receive first. She had that habit.
Bina's love of her animals was spoken of far and wide. It was often said that she would ensure that the animals were fed and seen to before she would look after herself. Stories are told of visitors dropping into Bina's house to be greeted by cats, dogs and sheep, all taking pride of place on the sparse furniture that she had in the place she called home. Known as Ireland's last shepherdess, Bina worked tirelessly in the hills of Connemara, tending her beloved sheep, hail, rain or shine.
Bina was a farming woman. She had a lot of sheep, cows, horses, donkeys, ducks, geese, cats.
I remember giving her a lift at one stage, and she had to bring her dog with her. It was very important that the dog travelled.
Next year will be our 50th year of running the sheep show. Bina always made a donation towards that sheep show because it was very near her heart. Anything to do with animals and farming was very near her heart, so she always donated to the sheep show, to the Lean Sheep Show.
The title Queen of Connemara was bestowed on Bina at a ceremony in the Rock Bar at Gimla.
The Rock Bar opened in 1969. She was queened by Basil Moore, which is better known as Dan the Street Singer.
He was in charge of the hooly-booly for the opening of the new Rock Bar.
But oh, the ache that's in them for the spot where I was born.
And that night, they declared Bina Queen of Connemara. And she was thereafter known as the Queen. And she'd be called in sometimes to open a little festival.
Bina used to be down on a Saturday night when we had music, and Bina would sing.
She'd sing a song. And she had all the folklore. She learned all the folklore. For example, how do you keep flies out of the kitchen? You put nettles into a jam jar and the flies will get out. She had all these cures and so on. And people found them fascinating. Oh yeah, our cure for illness is dress well and go out and walk. If you have a cold, you put on plenty of clothes on you and go out for a walk in the fresh air.
Whether what Bina offered were cures or spells is unclear, and in truth unimportant. That she was able to perform some kind of magic added to the intrigue attached to the legend that she was to become.
I don't believe she was a witch. I believe she was someone who, when she got frustrated, used various Irish idioms, etc., to express her frustration.
What is perhaps most interesting about Bina is that many locals were convinced that she had the ability to hex them with curses.
There was an odd person in the village that was afraid, and because of that they would do whatever it was, they would do her bidding.
But there was a great story about Pádraig Flynn, and there was no bad reflection on Pádraig Flynn. She wrote to Pádraig Flynn thinking she should get a grant for doing up the house. Now, there was no such grant, and the normal reply came from the minister's office, signed by the minister, saying, "We regret to inform you there's no grant for doing up your house." And she was very offended about this, and she felt that the minister should have the power, if Bina wanted a house, to give her a big grant. And I met her, and she said to me, she said, "I put a curse on Pádraig Flynn." And that was fair enough. I didn't pay much heed. But the next thing, Pádraig Flynn had a big bust-up with Charlie Haughey, and he lost his position in government. And I met her again, and she said, "I told you," she said. "I put a curse on him. Look at him now," she said. So I said to Bina, "Look, that's not right. You shouldn't be putting curses on people." And fair enough, she said, "Will I lift it, Eamon?" I said, "Yeah, I think you should lift it." And if you remember the sequence of events back in the back end of, I think it was 91 into 92, what happened then was that Charlie Haughey lost favour after a famous Nighthawks programme, and Pádraig Flynn came back into power and was made a minister again. And I met her again, and she said, "There you are, Eamon. I told you. I lifted the curse." And look at him now.
Callers to the local radio station she occasionally appeared on would beg her to lift her spells. A true enigmatic personality.
Now, as time went on then, when the local radio came, the Midwest radio, she became the star of it, really.
Well, now I think you'd be better off. He'd be better off now to mind his tongue.
She started to talk on a regular basis on Midwest radio. She'd sing an odd song for them and that kind of thing. But she became quite famous outside of the village after that.
People came from far and wide to see her. You know, they would come to see her animals and to talk to her, and they held her in great esteem. I mean, at the time when The Field was being filmed, like, Bina was central to all that was going on, and she was involved. And of course, she appears in The Field driving cattle through the village.
Bina had a keen interest in politics, both at a local and national level. She was a strong supporter of the Republican Fianna Fáil party, and was most especially fond of Eamon O'Keefe, a man she called Dev Og. Dev Og was the grandson of one of the founding fathers of the Irish state, Eamon de Valera. De Valera served as both the Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, and the President of Ireland. Having served as President for 14 years, De Valera retired from office in 1973 at the grand old age of 90, passing the political mantle to the next generation to come.
She was a dyed-in-the-wool, no pun intended, Fianna Fáil person.
She was part of the monumentous win for Dev Og in the 1992 Irish general election.
Around the mid-80s, I started getting involved in a small way in politics. I ran in a local election. But it was really when I started running in the national elections that Bina came big time on board and started canvassing and started getting involved with the party here locally. And, you know, elections can be great fun. Of course, one of the challenges getting elected out of a place like I live in here on the Mayo-Galway border, everything north of you was excluded territory, was in County Mayo. So we had a very small local base. And what we lacked in sheer electorate, we had in the enthusiasm of the teams. And Bina was one of the things, or one of the people who added a huge enthusiasm to the team, because to put it mildly, she did it her way and she did it differently. And I think some people have seen the photographs of her out canvassing with a big picture of me on her chest, going round. She'd go into the city in Galway, and she would go everywhere canvassing. And she, for example, I remember one time she went in canvassing the halting sites in Galway, the travellers, because she knew them very well and they respected her. So she had to reach into places that maybe some of us in those days wouldn't have had to reach, but where I would have a reach now, largely thanks to the initial introductions I got from Bina. I remember one election count that they were in, and it went on very, very late into the night, and then got suspended and was finishing the following morning. But she and another, sadly passed away, a younger person, literally spent the night in Galway walking the prom till the following morning. They had no lodgings for the night and people had gone home and so on. She'd no way home, she never drove a car. But she was there again in the morning, and they literally walked around Galway and down Salt Hill until the count was over. So there was that dedication. But I think she knew that we really valued her. We valued the work she did, but we also valued the fun, the colour that she brought to it. And of course she loved election celebrations, and she'd always have a bonfire. And I remember one election, we especially came back here to Leenane because we knew she'd want to be part of the homecoming, even though, as you're probably aware, Leenane's a bit off the beaten track in North Connemara, where we'd normally come in on the Cong side and have done Clonborough and Clough and into Cardamona, where I was living. But we came all the way back here because Bina would have a bonfire here, and we wanted a bit of fun and we wanted a bit of camaraderie. So I think that that was important with her. I failed to get elected to the Dáil in 1987, and I failed to get elected in 1989, and in 1989 I missed it by 127 votes, and there was heartbreak in this area, and there was a big question, could you physically manage to do it out of this neck of the woods because of the lack of population? And you were up against the city of Galway, a big area all the way down to Gort in those days. I luckily enough made the Senate. I got elected to the Senate in 89, and the big election, the make or break election, was 92. And the effort put in that election by so many people was absolutely phenomenal. The enthusiasm to push me over the line this time with no method was absolutely incredible. Now, you might remember the 1992 election. It was the election that Albert Reynolds and Des O'Malley had fallen out about, and Fianna Fáil did very, very badly. And I can always remember afterwards seeing the clip of the television about my election and the figures coming in saying Galway West, Fianna Fáil up 4%, and Gary Fitzgerald was a great man for statistics, and he said, that has to be all wrong. That's all wrong, it couldn't be, but it was actually true. But we all gathered in Galway in a hostelry near the count centre in the west side. And at the appropriate moment, about a half an hour before they declared the actual count, we marched en masse down to the count centre. And Kevin Tady, as we call him, from MAM, led the way, and he had a big accordion. And we went into the count centre, and there must have been 300 people, supporters of mine from all over the place, that were there for the big night. And they were in some mood for celebration, because even though the count hadn't been announced, everybody knows from the tallies and whatever. And amazingly, Michael D. Higgins, our president, topped me all right on that election, but he was running on his own on the ticket. But I was by far ahead of my two running mates on the Fianna Fáil ticket, and I got elected on the first count, and we knew that that was going to happen. So they all went into the count centre, and there was bedlam and noise and whatever. And I don't think it ever happened before, and I'm sure it'll never be allowed again, is they started a céilí in on the count centre before the count was even announced. And there is fantastic film footage of Kevin playing on his accordion with Kieran Burke, who was a pub owner and is a pub owner from Clonbur, and Bina McLoughlin doing a dance in the middle of the Count Centre floor. And this, in my view, is one of the most iconic election pictures ever, to see people dancing, not after the announcement of the count, but before the announcement of the count, in absolute joy at the election. Right in the centre is Bina McLoughlin and Kieran Burke, two fantastic characters, doing a jig around the floor.
Years of hard work on the land had taken its toll on her. Much in all, as she tried to put on a brave face, those closest to Bina could tell that the end was near. Working the land was no easy task. The physical exertion that Bina would have endured for many years in all weathers was finally to catch up with her on February 16th, 2001.
I saw her health going down. I saw her, she shouldn't have been going up that mountain.
When people heard she had been ill, people were concerned and people, were worried for her. Now she rallied for a period of time and she got on with life.
She was sitting up in the, out on the chair in the hospital when I went to see her, quite near, I didn't realise, but it was quite near her end. And she was having boiled milk with pepper in it, which she claimed was excellent for the stomach and for gas. And she was having her drink there, but she was quite philosophical and quite quiet. And I left her that day not realising that I would never see her alive again.
I'd say that in the end, she kept going to the hills when she shouldn't have, and she enlarged her heart.
She knew that the heart was packing up and that she was getting weaker, and that she had quietly been getting people to help her on the farm work and so on, because things were getting too heavy for her. But I didn't know that, and you wouldn't know that looking at her. What then happened was she went home, and really they shouldn't have sent her home in as much as the house wasn't in very good condition. And then she went back into the hospital in Merlin Park this time. And I went in to see her, and there was a famous incident, and it's recorded, I think, in some of the newspapers at the time she died, that when I went in to see her, she asked me for the fáinne, like the one I'm wearing. And I gave her the fáinne more than willingly. And she wore the fáinne until she died. And she appeared in good form. And I was very, very worried because I knew the condition of the house and I was afraid they might send her home, discharge her, not realising that there was no way could she go home to the house in Quillickbeg in Leenane. So I went to the nurse and I said, look, there's a problem here. I said, if you saw the house this lady lives in, whatever happens, she cannot be discharged there. So she said, will you hang on a few minutes? And I waited round, and the next thing, a doctor appeared. And he said to me, look, I can talk to you because you've been listed by her as next of kin. And therefore he said, I can open up and tell you what the situation is. So fair enough, he showed me the chart and he said, she's very, very short time left to live. And he showed me the rhythm of the heart.
I got this phone call one morning from the minister, Eamon O'Keefe, to tell me that Bina was dead. Oh, I got such a shock. She died far too young.
Bina McLoughlin died in Merlin Park Hospital, Galway on Friday, February the 16th, 2001. 3 days later, she was laid to rest in the cemetery across from the parish church in Leenane, County Galway.
It takes articulate people like Bina, and remember, articulation is the sign of intelligence, to tell the story of our people to us today. A thing I've learned about people over the years, when you have very little world's possessions, when you have very little degrees and all these statuses, you have only your personality. Bina had only her personality, but her personality was more than enough. She was a kind and generous woman. And Bina had very little money, because Bina had no interest in money. She was a mystic in many ways. She was very witty and humorous. And you know, only human beings have humor. We cannot find humor in any other animals. And it's through humor that we have the victory of the spirit over matter. Once we laugh at something, we have conquered it. Now, Bina had a very hard life. She had very little of the world's goods, and she wasn't interested in building luxuries for herself. She had more respect for the animals, very often for their comfort than for her own. Her love of animals was Franciscan. I'm sure she did talk to me. She enjoyed Irish music. We all knew her political commitments. She was strong-willed. She often disagreed with me, but I don't think we ever fell out. Maybe for a short time, but we made it up again. Because she could be difficult at times. Sorry, Bina. Goodbye, Bina, and thank you for being yourself. You have taught us all a lesson of what is important in life. Ar yeshte goreva hanam usa. Nan manahar sa vixen fridley.
Bina's relationship with Eamon O'Keefe would take on a whole new significance following her death in February 2001.
She had looked after everything right to the very end. Now, she hadn't told me that she'd named me as next of kin, but she had done that out of her own bat. Now, in relation to the property, over the years, she'd be on the phone and she'd say to me, I'm going to leave the... Well, what she'd actually say to me was, which of the lads is my favourite? And the one that was her favourite was my son Brian, my second son. And I'd say, Brian, I'm going to leave the place to him because you won't take it, and so on. And we'd have these discussions, and I kept saying to her, look, I don't want a farm, I don't want houses, I don't want anything buying it. But she was very, very insistent. And as a consequence, a will was made. And it left it not only to me, but to my wife and 4 children. But there was so once that became, knowledge, once we were aware of that, immediately on her death, and I have the letter here, in fact, that I wrote to this solicitor saying, look, there's no way we're taking this. We arranged to get the documentation together. All of my children readily agreed to sign back because they all had to sign, as well as myself and my wife. And I have the letter that I sent to the solicitor with the instructions and basically saying, look, we're out of this. Now, I was also the executor of the will, so I had to look after all the affairs of making sure everything was handed intact to the main beneficiaries being her sisters. But there were 2 other beneficiaries. There was one cousin she left a site to, and there was another cousin she left some money to. But what we did ask the family, and they did agree to this. Now, it was a voluntary agreement because there was no way of putting conditions on giving it back. You either give it back or you don't. But we asked them to give €2,000 towards the upkeep of Mamain, 2,000 towards the upkeep of Leanan Church, €300, or £300, should I say, because this was in the pounds day, each to Father Mooney and Father Durkin for masses for the repose of her soul. Again, she was very friendly with all of the priests that were here. And €2,000, or £2,000, should I say, towards the Leanan Sheep Show, the place where it all started, in terms of the connection between me and Bina.
Shortly before her passing, Bina enlisted the help of her good friend Eamon O'Keefe to put together a plan that was to cause consternation after her death.
Minister, what's the problem? 10 days ago, he said I was in to see her. And she asked for she gave me a bit of paper and a pen. And she said to me, write this down. When I die, I want to be buried in my own land. Give me that now, she says. And she signed it and dated it. And she handed it back to the minister. And you see that that happens. And the minister said to me on the phone, I hope now you won't mind me telling it, "Get the enemy. Get the What can I do?" Eamon and I never spoke English, and I say he spoke Irish to Bina too. And I said, you have to honour her request. There's no other way out. You have to write now to the Secretary of Galway County Council for permission to bury her in her own land. And of course you won't get it.
No, I contacted Galway County Council and they said, no way, can you do that? It's just not possible. And we will not give a license for that to happen.
Because there's a hygiene problem, there's a whole lot of things. And then I'll take over, I said.
Father McGrail was quick to come up with a compromise.
I says, we'll bury her with her family whom she loved, but we'll put the tombstone up in her own land.
So what will be remembered now that the dust has settled in the village of Leenane and the Queen of Connemara is gone?
Loyalty, friendship, fun. She was a great person to be around, but absolutely love of animals. And she had all the animals and they were part of her household, you could say. I remember, but mainly for her personality and for this outgoing personality, and you couldn't knock her down. She was full of life, full of energy, full of zest. And I think the story about her asking me into the hospital and then doing the canvas, but that woman knew, and that only became apparent after she died, that she knew she was nearing her end, but she was still going and she was still driving for me and she was still, full of that zest for life that was always there, even though on the other hand, you could see with all of the preparations she made, many of which only became apparent after she died, that she was more than aware of her own mortality and that she really, really knew that, time was very, very short. But you had this great person who didn't self-pity at all and just lived it literally to the very end.
Bina had empathy. Empathy is the greatest Christian virtue. What is empathy? She sensed the pain of others. Another thing, she was very proud of the Irish tradition. She was very proud, too, of being rural and a peasant. I'm very proud of it, too. I think the peasant has more... For the peasant, everything is personal. For Bina, everything was personal. And she had a sense of humour. Bina was a comedian. And Bina was coloured.
Her body rests in peace above the beautiful fjord at Killary. Some speak kindly of the gentle queen. Others are willing to forget the enigma that was Bina McLoughlin. But hers is a story worth telling. A tale of a time and a character that could no longer exist in our somewhat more bland and uniform world. Maumain lives as a shrine, not to Bina, but for a new generation of pilgrims that might remember her as they pass through and offer a prayer to the Queen of Connemara.
The scenic town of Fairleenan, one only Queen will hail. For its off she shone throughout the crowd at pilgrimage and fair. Her glamorous attire unique, and her necklace is galore. Charmed many's a man as with sparkling eye as she strolled down Leenane shore.